Hi everyone, my name is Adi and welcome back to the channel. As you're probably aware, the regional qualifier stage of Players Cup 2 just wrapped up and they have narrowed the top 256 players in each region to the top 4 who will compete in the grand finals of this tournament in December. Today I am excited to introduce another top performer from this tournament who got all the way to top 12 in North America, introducing Jackson Finch.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm doing well, how are you?
Doing pretty well myself.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
My name's Jackson. I'm from San Diego. I've been playing VGC since I was a senior in 2016. I had a few notable results in 2018. But yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, and so if I recall correctly, you got top 8 at U.S. Nationals in 2018 or
I
USCNS.
sure, I sure did.
Yeah, and that was with a really cool Sun team that I
Yeah.
think whenever people go back and play 2018, everyone always looks at this team as the Sun team that they want to use or they want to beat. And so you really had your mark on the metagame there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not like the building of this team can be completely credited to me, but I'm quite proud of the fact that that mine's like the definitive version.
Yeah, it's definitely the one that was best tailored to what the metagame ended up becoming, I think.
Yeah,
And so this time, 3 years later, 2 years later, I guess it's 2 years later,
yeah, it's
you
true.
have built another Sun team that has
Yeah.
done performed really well. Maybe not as late into the metagame, but certainly done pretty
Hmm.
well.
Yeah.
Can you talk me through the team building process for this team, and maybe how the 2 weeks between Crown Tundra dropping and Team Lock went for you?
Yeah, for sure. I use Sun throughout Series 5. Basically toward the end of the metagame, I realized that there are two Pokemon that you should realistically be using on every single team. Like if you're not using Cinderace, you're not using Venusaur. There's no excuse. So like I had a fair amount of excuse or a fair amount of experience with Sun as an archetype prior to Series 7, and I actually used a fairly similar team with uh, or a fairly similar Sun team in the qualifier, the IC. So yeah, I had a lot of Sun background, and I wasn't planning on using Sun initially. I sort of built it like as Crown Tundra dropped, and I was like, okay, well, this is a fallback because it's something that I'm familiar with more than anything else. And I ended up trying to build something centered around like Incineroar, Feeny, Kartana type stuff, and it never ended up working out quite as well as this did. Um, so about a week before Players Cup, I decided, you know what, I'm gonna scrap any Incineroar Feeny type stuff and just try to make this as good as it can be. And so yeah, this is what I came up with. I ended up starting with Stack Indeedee Torkoal Venusaur, and I think that's like a very oppressive four Pokemon, and it's probably a four that I brought to I'd say like 2/3 of my matches in Players Cup. It's yeah, it's quite threatening. I'm glad that I ended up finding Stacka before pretty early on, so that I had this amount of comfort with it. But yeah, and then the Landorus and the Thundurus sort of rounded out certain problem areas. Like there were a couple of weaknesses like Heatran that were easily covered by Landorus. An electric immunity is nice in a meta that sees a lot of Regieleki. Uh, and then Thundurus, there were a handful of reasons that I went with that in the last slot. I toyed around with a couple of different things. My first slot in my first last slot was Charizard. And I didn't quite like it because it just seemed, redundant. It seemed like the Charizard game plans would sort of take away from the Venusaur ones. And for the last slot, I wanted something that had a fair amount of pressure in team preview, and then basically covered like the mirror and some like Dragapult stuff, some Moltres stuff, and that Thundurus ended up fitting the bill pretty perfectly.
I think it's really interesting to see these Sun teams that I think really overperformed in Players Cup. I think there were 4 Sun teams in top 16 in North America, and leading into the tournament, I don't think people were really respecting it as much as they should have, because I didn't really see that much of it on the ladder when I was testing my games, and so it really overperformed. It really was sort of an under the radar pick, and what's really cool about it is that all 4 of the team, or 3 of the 4 teams, were very different. I think that Tommy and Dawn used the same Sun team to get top 16. But so, and then on Twitter, you said you wanted to make a guide to Sun for this format. So tell me, why should we use your Sun team over the Sun team that Nails used, or this team that Tommy and Dawn used?
Yeah, so I think of the 4, I mean there are only 3 teams, but 4 top cut slots or top 16 slots, and I think that mine is probably the most traditional when it comes to 2020 Sun. The Donchek version of it with the Whimsicott, I think the only real similarity there was that it had a Torkoal. I think they had a Landorus too, but I think the game plans there are quite different. And I ended up after Players Cup trying out their team on ladder and made a couple of changes, and I found out that it was more focused around Charizard, Whimsicott, and like Nihilego, Kartana, or not Kartana stuff, but I ended up adding a Kartana later. More that stuff than the typical bringing Torkoal. Like Torkoal rarely ever came for me in that sense, and it was just sort of like hyper offense that happened to have a Charizard with solar power on it. And Nails' team, or I guess it's the team that Smogon has been toying with for about since Series 5. It's like it's a really cool take on Sun with the Bind Dusclops and Grimmsnarl, but I think it's a little bit. It's more like a team disguised as Sun, I guess. Like it's more focused around residual damage, defensive pivoting, and making the opponent uncomfortable enough to stall out the game with a Dusclops, or take them out on residual damage with Vine Lash and stuff. I think my team probably hits the most I guess balance of the two ideas. I think both of the other teams are of comparable quality, but I don't think it's like I don't think it's there's an absolute way to run Sun. I think that mine just happened to be sort of a middle ground.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, this is very similar to the traditional Sun teams that we saw for a lot of Series 5. And also, interestingly enough, it also has a defined flying type, just like your Sun team from 2018.
Yeah.
How much do you think? How important do you think the comfort level of you with Sun played into your success in this tournament?
I think it absolutely did. If I had a better team that I was less comfortable with, I don't think I would have performed nearly as well. I think I don't necessarily think it was an objective call for the event, but it definitely it catered to the things that I was familiar with, and I think that really carried me pretty far.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, especially in the early metagame, if you are comfortable with your team and it's a strong team, it doesn't have to be the best team. It has to just be pretty strong. And if you just outplay your opponents, you can get really far, as you did, and as a lot of people did. So let's talk about the team itself and some of the Pokemon on the team. I think that all these Sun teams have different trick room setters, and you chose Stakataka. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose Stack over something else?
Yeah, so I think on Sun, I think we found out, I would say like probably like Series 4-ish. We found out that rock types on Sun are pretty good, given what counterplay to Venusaur looks like. And basically in in order to beat Venusaur consistently, you're one of the main options to go about dealing with the pressure that it puts out is a Dynamax fire or Dynamax flying type, because the Venusaur, the best it can do to stop it is put it to sleep. And Stack Attack complements that pretty well, given that it hits both super effectively and only fire hits it neutrally. So it's just I think it's more about their ability to prep for both. Like it's difficult to see a Stack Attack and a Venusaur in team preview and have a definitive way of going about dealing with both.
Right. That's definitely true. They have you can't really use flying moves into the stack. If you switch the Venusaur out and Stack Attack, for example, you're taking it. Or if they just lead a flying type into it, you're not doing very much damage, especially since basically all the flying types nowadays are physical. They might not have coverage to stack, and it's ridiculously high defense stat. And then on top of that, you chose to run a Shaka Berry on it so that it would take ground types attack a little better. And you chose to run a set that didn't have an attack boosting nature and IVs with Beast Boost, which is a little different from one of the other teams on the channel, Victor's team, that did well in the European side. But you also chose to run Body Press on it, so that I think it could make use of the Steel Spike boost a little better.
Yeah.
How did that fare for you? How did it? Did you feel like the damage output was okay, and did the Shaka Berry really put in work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's less about the damage output being supplemented by Body Press and more about I think Body Press being a secondary mode of damage output. Like if their way of dealing with Stack Attack was cycling Intimidate, they weren't going to be dealing with Body Press the same way. And it's not like it was maxing Stack Attack more than anything else, but being able to utilize those Beast Boosts and Steel Spike boosts was it definitely made certain end games a lot easier and was a lot more threatening for the opponent to have to deal with.
Yeah, this is definitely a Pokemon that I am very interested in because I've been playing with them myself, and I think that rock types, especially right now, we saw not only we saw Nihilego specifically do very, very well in Players Cup, another rock type. Two of them again on Tommy and Don's Sun team. And so I definitely think that with all the Airstream abuse that's happening in this format, you definitely see a lot more utility for rock types, and Stack Attack is one that I think is really cool in this metagame right now. And then, so can you tell me a little bit about the rest of the Pokemon on the team?
So I think Torkoal and Venusaur are pretty self-explanatory. I ended up toward the end of Series 5, it was sort of looking like Protective or Sleep Powder was, more optimal in the long run, and it was something that I played around with a little bit, but I think that Sleep Powder being able to not only bail certain situations, but the fact that A, it puts on pressure in team preview, and B, it's a bit better of an answer to the power creep. Like if you're dealing with higher power level Pokemon, higher defense stats, all that, it's going to be a lot more threatening to make it immobile than it is to chunk it for 70 or 80%. And in Nails' team, I saw that he was running a defensive Torkoal, which is pretty common. I would argue probably the most common Torkoal set in Series 5. And I ended up going with an offensive version of it just because I think that the damage it puts out is a lot more threatening than a defensive set would be. And it's not like I was really taking advantage of Yawn or the Torkoal sticking around or anything. Anyway,
and I definitely think that one of the cool things about Torkoal in this format is that, in my opinion, one of the best Pokemon of the format, if not the best Pokemon of the format, is Glastrier. And that has very few weaknesses, and one of those weaknesses is fire. And Torkoal not only being a fire type, but also being slower than it and very physically defensive makes
Yeah.
it one of the best checks to it. And so but it's Glacier is still like stupidly bulky. And so if
Yeah.
you're not running an offensive Torkoal, you're just not doing enough damage to Glacier to actually call Torkoal a counter to it.
Exactly.
So that was definitely one of the things that when I was testing out my own Torkoal, I felt like it needed to be a little more offensive. That being said, you do still have Burning Jealousy on it for a little more
Yeah.
counterplay to boosting moves. You saw Body Press on it. Why did you choose to run Body Press?
So that's probably the only slot on the team that I'm not 100% certain is, necessary or optimal. I chose body press because it hits the rock types like Tyranitar or uh opposing or, like certain steel types as well, like Heatran, super effectively. But at the end of the day, I ended up struggling with Heatran a little bit more than I should have. I didn't play any in Players Cup, but I was considering Earth Power for that reason. But there are a couple of cute things that you can do with Body Press. Torkoal has such a high natural physical defense stat that you don't even need to invest in it to do damage. But there are options for steel spiking with Stack Attacka and body pressing in the same turn in Trick Room, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And then it sounds like the last Pokemon on that core Sun mode was Indeedee female, which of course is the one with redirection. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose the set that you did for that?
Yeah, so was I was testing Togekiss in the slot, and it didn't end up pulling its weight very well because I was a little bit hesitant to lead Trick Room into stuff like a Mungus because Spore was such a relevant factor that I couldn't realistically set Trick Room, and bring in Torkoal to threaten the Amoonguss and have enough pressure against whatever they could do with a Pokemon that isn't Amoonguss. So I decided that if the redirection that was in this slot needed to be A, follow me so that it could redirect Spore, and B, have goggles. And I think Indeedee also being able to hit Amoonguss on a team where the only other ways of hitting it really, really strongly are Airstream with Thundurus and Torkoal. So I think the psychic typing was pretty important. And there is another thing that sort of made me consider Indeedee for the slot over Togekiss. And that was the fact that I can reset terrain from Tapu Fini in order to Sleep Powder. So that was something that was like relatively common in VGC 17 with Lilligant Torkoal, where they could just lead Lilligant Torkoal, and since Torkoal's the slowest Pokemon, no matter what they switch into terrain, if they don't have a Pokemon that's slower than Torkoal, your Torkoal will be switching into terrain after they switch in their terrain. So you can almost always switch into Torkoal and Sleep Powder if you're sure that a slot isn't going to protect.
Yeah.
Or switch into Indeedee and Sleep Powder, rather.
It's always nice to have that option when you feel like you led a little bit on the back foot, or it makes Torkoal Venusaur a lot safer a lead against a lot of teams, it seems like. And then you chose to run a calm nature on the Indeedee and a very specially defensive, you chose calm nature but a very physically defensive set, or I guess pretty mixed defense. We've seen a lot of bold Indeedee with a lot more defense investment. What was the EV spread meant to do?
Yeah, so it's really unfortunate that Indeedee needs like 5 more stats somewhere for me to be comfortable with it, but it lives a Life Orb Dragapult Max Wormwind, and I think it lives a Max Special Attack Moltres Max Darkness, but both of them aren't like very comfortable rolls. They aren't like 100% of the time I'm guaranteed to come out of that alive. It's like I think it's like an 18% and a 6.3 chance for Indeedee to die, but I think that was relatively fine given what I used it for.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you said that those were like the four Pokemon that you felt like you brought the most.
Mm.
Talk me through the Landorus and Thundurus sets and a little bit about when you brought those Pokemon.
I really enjoyed Choice Band Landorus in testing. It in a team where Venusaur and Sakataka want to max more than anything by a long shot, it's very nice having Pokemon that do damage without requiring Dynamax. And Landorus, was a pick that fit the bill there pretty well. So I wanted a ground type. I think there's very little reason to not use Landorus on Sun anyway, given that it effectively has one weakness in Ice in the Sun, and it hits the Fire Rock types that you weren't hitting with your your Torkoal and your Venusaur. So and then the Thundurus, it was much more of a situational bring. You could get away with bringing it into uh, fatter builds like Moltres and Kartana, Fini, Dragapult stuff, and I basically used it just for that in the tournament. And on the ladder, I ended up bringing it in the Sun Mirror because it has the Lumberry so that it can avoid the Sleep Powder from opposing Venusaur, and it can knock it out in with Airstream, and it also threatens Charizard if they were to run that as well.
So you weren't. It's interesting because you weren't scared of Landorus leading into your Stakataka as much because of the Shuckleberry, but
Yeah,
you still had that Defiant user, so they like really couldn't lead the Landorus at all. And
yeah,
Landorus is something that a lot of people said, "Oh, I have a Landorus, and therefore I have a Sun matchup. I can just Dynamax the Landorus, and I'm probably fine." And so I think
yeah.
the Thundurus really throws that game plan off, just because it's so difficult to actually bring it in if you have a Thundurus on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most work it put in was in team preview, with just deterring Landorus and Incineroar.
Mhm. And then I think the combination of Thundurus and Landorus is also very cool, especially when the Landorus is choice banded, because
Mm.
Landorus really appreciates the Airstream boost. It can appreciate the Knuckle boost. It can Earthquake really safely next to Thundurus, and
Yeah.
flying it with the ground spread move is a perfect pin,
Mm.
or near perfect pin. And so that was something that I noticed when I was testing out Hirofumi's original team that was like
Mm.
released basically like 2 days after Count Thunder was released, and kind of introduced the metagame to Thundurus Urshifu, which was such an omnipresent threat leading up to, and it still is an omnipresent threat in the metagame.
Yeah.
And I feel like having the pressure of Thundurus Landorus as a lead definitely scares a lot of teams. Did you feel like you brought that pretty often, or not very often at all?
Um, I didn't bring it very often. The threat of it is very real, but I ended up bringing it on occasion, on a mix-up game 2 or 3. Uh, but yeah, I basically only brought it into like the Moltres and Dragapult builds that I mentioned earlier.
Mhm. And so, can you talk me through some of the strength of this team and some of the tougher matchups for this team?
For sure. I think comfort with Sun is probably one of the scariest things. And not only that, I think that having to play against Sun is going to put a lot more stress on your opponent than it is going to put on the Sun user. If you're, uh, you know, I, I don't necessarily rely on Sleep Powder, and I feel like a lot of Sun is, a lot of good Sun builds won't rely on Sleep Powder as much. But seeing all of these, just disgusting threats in team preview is enough to make them, nervous while I'm chilling if I'm comfortable with it. And so yeah, and I think it's probably one of the most focused offenses right now in the current format. Like I you can see my team and you can know what it wants to do for the most part. And given certain matchups and certain matchup experience, you can uh, find out which variants of the offense you prefer in specific situations. But in a lot of cases, you have enough tools to work with, as long as you know what on the opponent's team you need to counter. But I think some of the weaknesses are that in certain uncertain situations, landing sleep powder becomes somewhat of a requirement. I let's say I'm unsure if they're going to lead something that is good into stack attacka or something that's good into Venusaur. If I lead Torkoal Venusaur and they lead something that's good into it, then in order to cover every option, I would need to land a sleep powder in that case. But yeah, that's probably the main issue. I found some issue with Heatran, but it was really only slightly uncomfortable. I have two body presses, Landorus and a Venusaur, or Earth Power on Venusaur, so it's not unwinnable by any stretch. But I think that about covers it.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that reminds me of something that Gavin Michaels told me in his interview after Players Cup 1 was that the way his team worked and the way this team seems to work is that you have so many options and so many different things that you have to cover when you're facing this team, and there's no one move that covers all of them, and so your opponent has to try to cover 4 or 5 different things, and you just have to choose one of them, and if they happen to not cover it, then you win. But you don't have what they have. Each of their options covers one of those things. And so when your worst matchup is like, oh, well, I have to hit this 75% accurate move, you're still winning it 75% of the time. Like, that's pretty dumb. And then, so what do you have a match that you would consider the highlight of the tournament or one of the most memorable matches during your run?
I'm trying to think. I don't think there were any that were like, this is the pinnacle of VGC gameplay, because a lot of the matches that I did play were washes in one way or another. I had a couple of close matches in my early rounds, but it was nothing that's that left me saying, wow. I had an interesting set with Alex Underhill that knocked me out of the tournament, and it probably is worth further analysis. I think it's interesting how the dynamics of Regigigas work, and you might have seen certain plays that looked questionable on my end or certain plays that looked questionable on his end, and it just ended up being us being in each other's heads. So
yeah, I mean, I worked with Alex to build that team. That team report is also going to be on the channel if it's not out already when you're watching this. And so it's a very cool team as well that also has a similar dynamic where you have a lot of different options, like a surprising amount of options, and you have to for all of them all at once. And so, and yeah, that was I know that Alex signed an NDA, so he might have recorded matches and therefore might be on stream for that match. We don't know. It might be on the December stream that you can watch, which has not only a bunch of matches from the top 16 part of Players Cup from the North American side, but also it will have all the matches in the international level as well. So definitely make sure to check that out when it comes out. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. Sometime in December. Yeah. So thank you for coming out to the channel. This was really great. This is a really cool team, and very, very strong, very well-rounded Sun team that I think if you're comfortable with can win any tournament that you enter. Do you have any last words or shout outs that you want to give?
Gosh, I guess I have to shout out Will Marks because he was the person who suggested Indeedee. It's it was like a pretty obvious development, but I have to I don't know, follow my Twitter at MAO_VGC.
I think I have that too. There you
Sick.
go. Do you wear your Crocs in attack mode or defense mode?
I prefer attack mode Crocs.
Okay.
I feel like there's a lot more versatility in certain combat situations
That's
that would require this
that makes a lot of
orientation.
sense.
Yeah.
I think the Crocs are something that you wear when you're worried about getting attacked, but you're not really going to go on the offensive yourself. I think I'd rather wear sneakers if I was going to go on the
Yeah.
offensive. So I'm
Uh-huh.
definitely a defensive mode person myself, but you should
Okay.
definitely go follow Jackson, one of the best Twitter accounts on VGC Twitter, and
I
you
don't know
can
about that one.
and you can tell him what type of Crocs you like. And yes, thank you again so much for coming on. And
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
of course, until next time, catch you later.